The same man who sent 13,000 troops to crush illegal whiskey makers owned the largest whiskey distillery in America, George Washington, father of the country, and quietly, father of an 11,000-gallon-a-year liquor operation. That war against moonshiners didn't end when the rebels went home. It went underground. It lasted over 200 years, it killed people, it created criminals, and somehow, it accidentally built one of the biggest sports on Earth. Picture this. It's 1785. You're a farmer named Elijah. You live in a one-room cabin in western Pennsylvania, halfway up a mountain your wife hasn't left in 3 years. You've just harvested 200 bushels of corn. Good harvest. But there's a problem. The nearest market where anyone will buy your grain is on the other side of the Appalachian range. The roads are mud tracks. Your wagon can carry maybe 30 bushels at a time. The trip takes weeks. By the time your corn reaches a buyer, if it reaches a buyer, half of it has rotted. A bushel of corn sells for about 25 cents. After the cost of transport, you might clear a few dollars for an entire season's work. But there's another option. You can distill that corn into whiskey. Now 200 bushels of grain become a few dozen jugs of clear, high-proof liquor. It doesn't rot. It weighs a fraction of the grain. 2 horses can carry what would have filled 3 wagons. And the best part? That same bushel of corn, once it's liquid, fetches $1 or more. Whiskey didn't just solve a farming problem. It became the economy of the mountains. Farmers traded it for seeds and livestock. Doctors accepted it as payment. You could settle a debt, pay a fine, or buy a plow, all with a jug of corn liquor. Now, where did these mountain farmers learn to build stills in the first place? They brought the knowledge with them. Between 1717 and 1775, roughly 250,000 Scots-Irish immigrants settled in the Appalachian backcountry. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, home distilling wasn't a crime. It was a family tradition passed down for generations. They distilled barley and rye in the old country. In Appalachia, they switched to corn, the one crop that thrived in Rocky Mountain soil. They brought copper pot stills, recipes, and something else that would matter a great deal later, a bone-deep hatred of any government that tried to tell them what they could and couldn't do with their own grain. The word moonshine itself came from England. In the 1700s, it meant any work done at night by the light of the moon. It fit perfectly. Because very soon, these Appalachian distillers would have a powerful reason to work in the dark. The government was about to demand a cut. And the man behind that demand? He wasn't some minor bureaucrat. He was Alexander Hamilton. The Revolutionary War left the United States drowning in debt. Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, needed revenue. His solution: tax the one product that every farmer on the frontier depended on. In March 1791, Congress passed the distilled spirits tax, the first ever internal tax on a domestic product in United States history. The rate ranged from 6 to 18 cents per gallon. That sounds small. It wasn't. Here's what made the tax devastating. The system favored large commercial distillers in the East. They ran year-round and could absorb the cost. Small frontier farmers who distilled seasonally got crushed, and the tax had to be paid in cash, the one thing mountain families almost never had. Think about what that means. Your entire local economy runs on whiskey. You pay your debts in whiskey, you buy supplies with whiskey, and now the federal government says you owe them money for making it, and they won't accept whiskey as payment. Only cash, which you don't have, because you live on a mountain in 1791. So here's the question. You just fought a revolution against a government that taxed you without representation. You won. You bled for it. And now your own government is taxing the one product keeping your family fed. Would you pay? Most didn't. At first, the resistance was quiet. Farmers simply refused to register their stills. Tax collectors showed up and were turned away. Then it got uglier. Revenue agents, revenuers, found themselves threatened. Some were tarred and feathered, others were beaten. One detail the history books often skip: how did agents even find the stills? They couldn't, not easily. Mountain distillers hid their operations in hollows beneath thick forest canopy, near creeks that provided cold water and masked the sound. The smoke from a well-built still was nearly invisible in morning fog, so the government relied on informants, neighbors turning in neighbors. That made the hatred personal. By the summer of 1794, the situation exploded. In July, roughly 500 armed men in western Pennsylvania attacked and burned the home of John Neville, the regional tax inspector. Neville barely escaped with his life. President Washington faced a crisis. The Constitution was only 7 years old. If the federal government backed down, it would prove that its laws could be ignored by anyone with enough guns. On August 7, 1794, Washington issued a proclamation ordering the rebels to disperse. They ignored it. So Washington did something no other sitting president has done before or since. He personally mounted a horse and led troops into the field. He called up nearly 13,000 militia from 4 states: Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey. That force was roughly the size of the army he'd commanded during the entire Revolutionary War, all to collect a whiskey tax. And then, something strange happened. The army marched west. The rebels vanished. They slipped into the forests, hid their stills, and went home. About 150 people were arrested. 2 were convicted of treason. Washington pardoned both of them. No decisive battle, no glorious victory, just 13,000 soldiers walking through empty fields. But that anticlimax was the turning point, because Washington didn't just win the confrontation, he won by making the alternative unthinkable. The federal government would enforce its laws, period. The moonshiners understood the message, and they adapted. They didn't stop distilling, they got better at disappearing. Stills moved deeper into the mountains, into the most remote hollows of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Kentucky. Production became a family secret. Recipes were whispered, not written down. Entire communities protected their moonshiners the way villages once protected fugitives. The government had won the battle, but it had created an underground industry that would last for centuries. And by pushing distillers into the shadows, Washington's government had accidentally done something far more dangerous than losing tax revenue. It had made moonshine deadly. In 1927, a New York City man walked into a speakeasy and ordered a drink. Clear liquor, no label, tasted strong but not unusual. 6 hours later, his vision started blurring. By morning, everything was dark. He wasn't alone. That same batch reportedly blinded over 100 people and killed more than 30. The liquor had come from a makeshift still where nobody had thrown away the first liquid out of the pot. Here's why. When you distill alcohol, you don't just produce ethanol, the alcohol you can drink. You also produce methanol. The difference between those two molecules is a single carbon atom. They taste almost identical. Your body can't tell them apart until it's too late. Methanol evaporates at a slightly lower temperature than ethanol. So when the still starts producing liquid, methanol tends to concentrate in the first portion, what distillers call the foreshots. Trained distillers discard that first pour. It's the most basic safety rule in the craft. But untrained moonshiners, especially the thousands who rushed into illegal distilling during Prohibition, didn't always know this. Some didn't care. They sold everything that dripped out. Your body converts methanol into formaldehyde, then into formic acid, a toxin that attacks the optic nerve first. Just 2 teaspoons of methanol can cause permanent blindness. A single shot glass can kill. And methanol wasn't the only poison hiding in a moonshine jar. To save money on copper tubing, many moonshiners built their condensers out of old car radiators. It made practical sense. Radiators were cheap, widely available, and already designed to cool vapor. But they were never designed to touch anything you'd drink. Inside those radiators, lead solder, antifreeze residue, glycol compounds. When high-proof alcohol ran through them, it stripped the lead right off the metal and carried it into the jar. In the 1950s, doctors in North Carolina traced a cluster of lead poisoning cases directly to contaminated moonshine. The patients hadn't just gone blind. They suffered tremors, organ damage, and neurological problems that lasted years. Entire communities paid the price for cheap equipment and missing knowledge. The moonshine looked clean, smelled clean, tasted like any other batch. But the jar was already a poison delivery system before the first sip. Here's what makes this chapter so dark. The government knew the liquor was killing people. During Prohibition, federal authorities even ordered industrial alcohol, used in manufacturing, to be deliberately poisoned with methanol and other chemicals, specifically to discourage people from stealing and drinking it. They poisoned the supply, people died, and the moonshiners kept cooking. because Prohibition had just created the biggest market for illegal liquor in American history, and nothing, not blindness, not lead, not death, was going to stop it. When the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, it didn't stop Americans from drinking. It stopped them from drinking legally. Demand didn't drop. It exploded. In the cities, gangsters built empires on bootlegged liquor, but the supply chains ran straight back to those Appalachian hollows, where families who'd been making corn whiskey for generations suddenly had customers in every major city east of the Mississippi. Before Prohibition, a moonshiner might sell to his neighbors. Now, he was supplying entire metropolitan areas. The feds tried to keep up. Between 1921 and 1925, federal agents seized nearly 700,000 stills across the country. They barely made a dent. But making the whiskey was only half the problem. You had to move it, fast, without getting caught. That required a special kind of driver. They called them runners. And to understand what a runner did, you need to picture one specific night. It's 1940. A kid named Junior Johnson, barely old enough to see over the steering wheel, is behind the wheel of a 1940 Ford with a flathead V8 his father and uncle have rebuilt from scratch. The back seat is gone. In its place, over 100 gallons of corn whiskey in glass jars, stacked tight, wrapped in burlap to keep them from clinking. Junior knows the road from Wilkes County to the delivery point by memory. Every curve, every dip, every patch of gravel where the tires might slip. He knows it in the dark, because that's the only time he drives it. Headlights off, windows down so he can hear approaching engines. The rear suspension is stiffened with extra heavy springs, military grade, so the car doesn't sag under the weight. From the outside, the Ford looks bone stock. Under the hood, it's a race machine. If a revenuer's headlights appear behind him, Junior doesn't slow down. He pushes the Ford to 95 on roads meant for 30. He knows a hairpin turn 3 miles ahead where he can whip the car 180 degrees and disappear down a side road the agents don't know exists. The Atlanta police once called a Georgia runner named Roy Hall a genius at the wheel. That was the compliment from the men who couldn't catch him. Junior Johnson was never caught on the road. Not once. He got his federal conviction in 1956, not from a chase, but from a stakeout at his family's still. The agents couldn't beat him driving, so they waited until he stepped out of the car. He served 11 months in federal prison, and then he found a new use for everything he'd learned. But we'll get to what happened next. Because first, you need to understand what happened every weekend in the South during the 1930s and 40s, and why tens of thousands of people started paying money to watch moonshiners drive. The races started as bragging rights. Runners who'd outrun the law all week would gather on weekends at dirt tracks carved into cow pastures and fairground ovals. They'd line up their whiskey cars, the same machines that hauled illegal liquor, and race each other for cash and pride. People came to watch, not hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, at Atlanta's Lakewood Speedway, at the Beach and Road course in Daytona Beach, at Charlotte Speedway, a track built by two brothers who'd made their money bootlegging. These weren't hobby racers. These were men who'd spent years perfecting high-speed driving under the worst possible conditions: darkness, bad roads, loaded cars, and the threat of prison if they slowed down. When they hit a proper racetrack, they were already better than anyone else out there, and they weren't the only ones with bootlegging connections. The mechanics, the car owners, even the track promoters, a huge percentage of early stock car racing had deep ties to illegal liquor. One of those promoters was a driver named Bill France Sr. He'd placed 5th in a 1936 Daytona Beach race. He'd also seen how much money the crowds were willing to spend. But the sport was chaotic. No standard rules, no consistent scheduling, no way for drivers to build a reputation. France wanted to change that. In December 1947, France invited top racers, mechanics, and car owners to the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach. Over several days of meetings, they hammered out a plan: a single governing body with standard rules, consistent point systems, and organized schedules. On February 21, 1948, they incorporated the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, NASCAR, the organization's first sanctioned race at the top level. What would eventually become the Cup Series was held later that year. The winner was Red Byron. He was a moonshine runner. But nobody embodied the moonshine to racing pipeline like Junior Johnson. After his 11 months in prison, Johnson threw himself into racing, with the same fearlessness that had made him untouchable on mountain roads. He won 50 races in NASCAR's Premier Division, still the most wins ever by a driver who never won a championship. In 1960, he won the Daytona 500. That same year, Johnson discovered something that would change racing forever: drafting. During qualifying at Daytona, he realized that tucking his slower car behind a faster one reduced air resistance enough to keep pace. No one had used the technique in stock car racing before. Johnson turned a physics principle into a competitive weapon, the same kind of creative problem-solving that had kept him ahead of revenuers on dark mountain roads. In 1965, writer Tom Wolfe profiled Johnson in Esquire magazine. The title stuck: "The Last American Hero." Johnson became a team owner after retiring as a driver. His teams won 6 Cup championships. He brought Winston cigarettes into the sport as a major sponsor, reshaping NASCAR's financial model. And in 1986, President Ronald Reagan gave Junior Johnson a full presidential pardon for his moonshining conviction. Johnson said it was the best Christmas gift he ever got. Think about that arc. A teenage boy hauling illegal whiskey through the mountains at night, federal prison, 50 race wins, a presidential pardon, and eventually, a legal moonshine brand. In 2007, Johnson became part owner of Piedmont Distillers and launched Midnight Moon Moonshine. The same product that once sent him to prison was now sitting on liquor store shelves with his name on the label. He died in 2019 at age 88. NASCAR put him in the inaugural class of its Hall of Fame. And that Hall of Fame in Charlotte includes a moonshine exhibit, because the sport eventually realized that our origins are criminal wasn't a scandal. It was the best brand story in American sports. NASCAR allowed some moonshiners to leave the outlaw life behind, build careers, get pardons, sell legal whiskey. Popcorn Sutton became famous because he refused to leave it. Marvin Popcorn Sutton was born October 5, 1946, in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. He got his nickname in his 20s after destroying a popcorn machine in a bar with a pool cue. His father made corn whiskey. His grandfather made corn whiskey. The family tradition stretched back to the Scots-Irish immigrants who'd settled these mountains 2 centuries before popcorn was born. He didn't treat moonshining as a side job or a family secret. He treated it as an identity. In 1999, he published a book called Me and My Liquor. He starred in a documentary that won a regional Emmy. The History Channel featured him in 2007. He once said, "Jesus turned the water into wine. I turned it into liquor." But behind the folk hero image, there was a man caught between 2 worlds. The mountains he loved were changing. Legal distilleries were opening. The traditions he'd inherited were becoming tourist attractions. And the federal government still considered what he did a felony. In 2008, agents raided his property and found over 850 gallons of moonshine along with firearms. He was charged and convicted. The sentence? 18 months in federal prison. Popcorn Sutton was 62 years old. He'd spent his entire life in the open air of mountain hollows. His wife Pam later told reporters he couldn't go to prison. His mind would just not accept it. On March 16, 2009, 1 week before he was scheduled to report, Popcorn Sutton was found dead at his home in Cocke County, Tennessee. He'd taken his own life. The Wall Street Journal published his obituary. Academics described him as the embodiment of an Appalachian archetype. Fans from around the world have since visited Cocke County to pay their respects. But the reaction to his death also exposed a tension that runs through this entire story. Was Popcorn Sutton an independent spirit preserving a cultural tradition? Or was he a man trapped by a mythology that wouldn't let him adapt? The answer is probably both. And that's what makes his story hurt. A whiskey brand now carries his name. He appears posthumously on the Discovery Channel show Moonshiners. He's become the Paul Bunyan of moonshine, part real, part legend. But the man himself is gone, and the tradition he died defending had already started its transformation into something he might not have recognized. Here's a fact that sounds like a punchline. You know Mountain Dew? The neon green soda? It's named after moonshine. In the 1940s, 2 Tennessee brothers named Barney and Allie Hartman couldn't find a decent mixer for their whiskey in Knoxville. So they invented their own citrus soda and named it after the Appalachian slang for corn liquor. The original bottles featured a barefoot hillbilly with a rifle and a jug. The tagline, It'll tickle your innards. Pepsi bought the brand in 1964. Today it sells billions. In 2021, they launched an alcoholic version, Hard MTN Dew, closing a loop that started in an Appalachian still house 200 years ago. And the drink itself went legal too. In 2009, Tennessee changed its distilling laws. The following year, Ole Smoky opened in Gatlinburg, the first federally licensed moonshine distillery in East Tennessee's history. The founders were descendants of families who'd been making illegal whiskey for over a century. Same recipes, same techniques, except now they paid the tax. By 2022, Ole Smoky was welcoming over 5 million visitors a year. Apple pie moonshine, peach, cinnamon, all in mason jars, all perfectly legal. And then there's the final irony, George Washington. The president who marched 13,000 troops into western Pennsylvania to enforce a whiskey tax, the man whose government started this entire 200-year war. In 1797, 2 years before his death, Washington built a 2,250-square-foot whiskey distillery at Mount Vernon. His farm manager, a Scottish immigrant named James Anderson, convinced him it would be profitable. By 1799, that distillery was producing nearly 11,000 gallons a year, making it the largest whiskey operation in the United States. In the early 2000s, archaeologists reconstructed it. Today, you can visit Mount Vernon and buy a bottle of rye whiskey made using Washington's original recipe. 60% rye, 35% corn, 5% malted barley, distilled in copper pot stills on the exact footprint where enslaved workers Hanson, Peter, Nat, Daniel, James, and Timothy once did the hot, exhausting labor of making whiskey for a president. The man who sent an army to stop illegal distillers now has a gift shop that sells whiskey. The jars are prettier now, the labels are professional, the tax gets paid. But the chain that links a Scots-Irish farmer hiding a still in 1791 to a tourist sampling apple pie moonshine in Gatlinburg in 2026, that chain is unbroken. Corn, water, fire, copper, defiance. Every sip of legal moonshine carries the ghost of a runner who drove without headlights, a farmer who chose prison over paying a tax on his own grain, a man in overalls who couldn't accept a world that didn't need him anymore. The spirit hasn't changed, just the law around it. If this story surprised you, you're going to want to see our breakdown of how Prohibition accidentally created modern organized crime. That one's linked right here. And if you want stories like this every week, the real history behind things everyone thinks they already know, subscribe. We'll keep making them.